and welcome to Chatty AF, the anime feminist podcast. I'm Dee Hogan, a writer and editor for AniFem, as well as the owner of the anime blog, The Josei Next Door.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. I am an editor and writer for Anime Feminist, and I also run the blog I Have a Heroin Problem.
Hi, I'm Vrai Kaiser, and I am also an editor and contributor at Anime Feminist, and I run the blog Fashionable Tinfoil Accessories and the podcast Trash and Treasures.
Okay. For this episode of the podcast, we will be celebrating both the anime's recent completion and the print release of the manga by talking about the devastatingly good historical drama, Descending Stories, Showa Genroku Rakugo Shinju, which I'll probably just call Rakugo Shinju from now on, because that is a mouthful.
So many words.
That's a lot of words. So just to give you a little background information before we dig into it, Rakugo Shinju was adapted from the Josei manga written by Kumota Haruko. Fun fact, this was Kumota's first Josei series. Previously, she'd exclusively written yaoi, which are male-male romance titles. But you totally can't tell while watching Rakugo Shinju that she's interested in love stories between men. Like,
Totally heterosexual.
Like, not at all.
Totally heterosexual.
Super, yeah. The anime was produced by Studio Dean and directed by Hatakeyama Mamoru, and features an all-star cast of longtime voice actors, including Tomokazu Seki, Hayashibara Megumi, and, of course, Ishida Akira, who gives what I'm going to say is the greatest performance of his career as the protagonist, Bon.
I may finally stop thinking of him as Kaoru and also other people.
Yeah, he'll be Bon
Exactly.
from now on. For me, Rakugo was running at the same time as Classicaloid, and it was back-to-back, so I will think of him as Bon and also as Pad-kun, the snarky iPad.
Oh, of course.
He had a busy season. He has a lot of range.
Very similar series.
Oh, of course, yeah. So as the title suggests, Rakugo Shinju is about the world of Rakugo, a traditional Japanese storytelling art form. One person gets on a stage and tells a story to the audience using minimalist props and very little movement. It's actually a pretty cool thing, so if you are joining us, if you're somewhat new into this, I would say check it out online, because it's kind of neat. In very simple terms, the story follows the life of the Rakugo performer Bon. In less simple terms, it's a sweeping series covering about 80 years and 4 generations, and we do not have time to summarize the whole thing here. So we're assuming that if you're listening, you know the story already, or you don't mind being confused or spoiled. So spoiler alerts for the rest of the podcast. And that is kind of the end of my prologue. In case that didn't clue you in, I'm a huge fan of the series, and I could probably talk about it all day. I will do my very best not to monopolize this podcast. Caitlin and Vrai, I think it's safe to say that you're both view this one pretty positively as well.
I'm a big fan. Yeah, I really enjoyed the first season. I've watched the first season twice, maybe 3 times all the way through. The second season I have not revisited yet, but maybe someday.
It's very good, is the thing. It's good and full of feelings. I dragged my feet forever getting started on this because I'm terrible, but then I binge watched it in a day. Like the first...
I remember that, yeah, because you were like, I'm going to start Raku, and I was like, okay, cool, and then, like, by the end of the day, you were sending me, like, all caps lock messages about it, and I was like, oh god, did you finish? And you're like, yep, season 1 done.
At like 3 in the morning. Damn, so sad.
And I had to be careful, so I had to make sure that you'd finish it, because I didn't want to spoil anything, so I was like, you started yesterday, are you done? I was very impressed. I did not know it was... I watched it week to week, so I didn't know it was a binge watch. I thought maybe it wasn't one of those shows that you wanted to binge, necessarily. It might be one that you'd want to watch, like, a few episodes and then take a break and then watch a few kind of thing. No, turns out it's bingeable.
It's very bingeable. Actually...
It is pretty bingeable, actually,
Having had kind of a foot in both, because I tried to wait all the way through season 2 so I could binge it also, and I didn't make it. So... I watched the back half of season 2 week to week, and I think it's a much better experience binged because you can keep track of the recurrent narrative threads a little better, I think.
Mm-hmm. Or you can just watch every episode twice and take extensive 2 pages worth of notes like I did, and then you're good, and you won't forget anything.
I have very distinctive memories of just lying on the floor of the preschool I was working at, surrounded by sleeping children, watching it on my phone.
Oh.
I also had a big fight with my sister one time because we were both visiting our parents, and she wanted to watch Dawson's Creek on the TV. And I had my shitty laptop, and I was like, no, I'm watching this anime. Oh. You can deal with it. You can go watch your goddamn 90s teen soap opera on your computer.
Now, when I was 17 and depressed, I did watch every season of Dawson's Creek, so I can't throw too much shade.
I mean, I'm not... Listen, I've watched some shitty 90s teenage soap operas.
Oh, it's garbage. It's terrible garbage.
When it comes to, like, what gets priority for the TV, as opposed to a shitty laptop screen... I think
Rakugo Shinju is the winner. I think it's the clear winner in most situations, really.
Is this the nicest looking Studio Dean anime ever?
Oh, it's so beautiful.
It's absolutely up there. Yeah, listeners, in case you don't know, Studio Dean kind of has a reputation for quality anime with like all caps and a lot of sarcasm behind that word. But Rakugo Shinju, like the animation is
quality
pretty minimal.
Spelled with a KW.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. The animation is fairly minimal, but it still looks gorgeous. And a lot of that comes down to, I think, kind of the storyboarding. Hatakeyama has a really good eye for detail and body language, and it goes a long way when you don't necessarily have, like, a giant budget for dynamic Sakuga-style animation. Or resources or whatever. But, it's not always about money.
But, I mean, it just looks nicer.
And the thing is, he's done 2 other shows for Dean, Sankareya and Rosenmaiden Zurichspülen, which I probably butchered the pronunciation of that. But they were also like 2 of the best looking Studio Dean shows I've ever seen. So I do credit a lot of it to him. I think that looking over the production as the series director, I would guess that he sort of holds it to a high standard, and I think that goes a long way. Towards making the show just look beautiful. Also, the backgrounds are glorious. I think Studio Jack did those for Rakugo. And yeah, they're very lush and realistic, but in kind of an artistic, beautiful way, which is sort of the whole thing about the show, is it's kind of like couched between literal and emotional realism. And yeah, it looks amazing. So yeah, obviously we're all really high on this series. So this is going to be a lot of praising, probably. Which is good.
just a lot of tongue bathing. I'm. You could
You just had to make it sound dirty, didn't you?
Yes. Is that? I'm sorry. Is that not why I'm here? I'm confused.
Just to get the innuendos out of everything.
That's what I do.
That's why we keep Vrai around. But yeah. So but kind of keeping with that, the fact that we all did really like it so much, I figured I'd kind of start with what kind of hooked you into the show? What drew you to it? If you were kind of talking about with somebody else about like what about it that really stuck out to you and made you want to keep watching and got you invested in it, kind of what was that, especially in the early going?
Konatsu.
Oh, Konatsu is great.
You want to expand on that?
I obviously, I watched the series for all of the same reasons as everyone else. It's gorgeous. It's, beautifully written. All of the characters are incredibly compelling. But I have this thing for angry girls in my stories. Women who are, they have been wronged by society in some way, by gender roles, by, they're chafing against the sort of, expectations that are for them. And Konatsu, in the first couple episodes of the show, was absolutely 100% that kind of girl. I just completely fell in love with her. I thought she was a super interesting character. I couldn't wait to learn more about her. And then she barely appeared, or she barely appeared for the rest of the season, and then it was as a small child. But she was definitely sort of the first thing about the show that really, really grabbed hold of me and wouldn't let go.
Yeah, I think it's interesting coming in as a newcomer, because I know that, when people recommend the show to newcomers, I think there's a lot of, they already are cued in to be attached to Yotaro and Konatsu particularly. But then as you're watching it as a new viewer, I had a really hard time fixing on who those characters were, because they go away so quickly. Not because they're not great and I love them very much, but they are backgrounded for the entire first season.
Yeah, it's kind of a bold storytelling style because in that first episode, Yotaro and Konatsu are absolutely like the most charming, like sympathetic, easy to kind of want to root for right off the bat type characters. While Bon is who we don't even call that. We call him Yakumo at that point. You're not really sure what to think about him, and he seems like he might be kind of a jerk.
I mean, he is a jerk.
He is. He's a darling jerk.
Kinda.
He is a bad dad.
He's very grouchy.
Oh.
But then they shoot you back in time, and you start with him as a kid, and it kind of asks a lot of you to go, well, you're not going to see these characters you really liked for a while, but we hope that we'll get you to like these other characters instead. And for me anyway, they definitely succeeded on that. I know
Absolutely.
I know that what kind of drew me to it was, especially by the time I got to because the second episode you get into the backstory, and you're like, well, okay, what's going on here? And then by the third episode, which is the one where Shin goes to war and Bon has to stay behind, I was absolutely sold on the story and the characters because I started to kind of have a better feel for who Bon was and how, sort of terrified he was of abandonment and how much he wanted to be of use and look after people. And they just did a very good job that episode conveying that, especially in kind of the nuances of body language and little details, which I thought was really lovely. And it also did a nice job of like what you were saying, Caitlin, that first episode sets up this gender dynamic with Konatsu where she wants to be a Rakugo performer.
More on that later.
She wants to be the next Yakumo. She wants to be a Rakugo performer, but at this point women aren't allowed to perform, and so she's been sort of denied this. And then we zip back in time, and right away they kind of keep us connected to the early stuff with some of those similar themes, because when you meet Bon, he is this, sort of not traditionally masculine, more traditionally sort of feminine character, raised in a geisha house, enjoys dancing, and sort of gets that ripped away from him, partly because he's a boy, and partly because of his injury.
Right.
So,
it's very strong parallels there. It was very interesting to me from the start how Yakumo didn't really... You could see all of these similarities between them in their origins, and it was very interesting about how Yakumo, Bon, whatever we want to call them.
Characters' names change all the time. I just have to stick to Bon. So
I get really confused about which name I should call each character, but how Bon did not extend her understanding, because if he had been understanding, she wouldn't be this just absolutely furious at the world, furious at him. So he didn't. Where did his compassion for her situation go? And that was sort of one of the things that the show sort of slowly built up, like how they got to be that in that situation.
No, I think that's one of the best, like the stealth best relationships in the show is this the fact that they are very much the same kind of person in a lot of ways that isn't immediately apparent, and the way that their
Right.
mutual tragedy for probably the person over losing the person they loved more than anybody else has really left them sort of bereft, but also with this prickly kind of companionship, and it's real good.
it is, and the way it develops over the series. And I do think it's it's complicated for Bon because on the one hand I think he's on the one hand I think like from a personal perspective he kind of doesn't want anyone to get involved with Rakugo. So it's not just because Konatsu's a girl, it's like he's refusing to take any apprentices. He's kind of keeping people out of the industry and sort of causing it to die a little bit.
He is the Shinigami for Rakugo.
Yeah,
That's how he sees himself as the god of death, like ushering Rakugo into irrelevance, basically.
Yeah, but then I think there's that on the one hand, but then I think on the other hand, he's also a really good example of kind of internalized prejudices. How you kind of come to, even though he experienced those things as a kid, where he was kind of shoved out of a world because of his gender, you live in that society long enough that you kind of start to internalize it. And so Konatsu comes along and she's like, I want to be a Rakugo performer. And he's like, girls can't do that.
Like, I even didn't get to be a dancer. You don't get to be a Rakugo performer.
And it's very lovely how, you know, towards the very, very end of his life and their relationship together, he does come around on that. First by kind of just not stopping her from performing. He's just like, do whatever you want. But then when she does finally ask him to make her his apprentice, he's like, yeah, let's do it. And so it's beautiful. It's like, the show has a lot of emotional peaks, and that's definitely one of the major ones.
That, so that happened in the same episode where she announced she was pregnant.
Yeah.
I cried way, way more at her asking to be Yakumo's apprentice. Like, babies make me cry.
Oh.
Like, that's just who I am. I spend all day, every day around babies. Babies make me cry.
So.
I cried more when Konatsu asked Bon if she could be his apprentice than when she told Yotaro that she was pregnant.
Well, their relationship, I mean, I think that Konatsu and Yotaro make me very happy because they're very sweet, and they're the kind of relationship that I can give a shit about because I have an idea when I watch them of why they like being around each other and like what they would talk about, which I think a lot of heterosexual ships in anime do not bother with that. It's just like, hey,
I think that's true of a lot of ships in anime. Like, I think there's a lot of BL where I have a hard time knowing what they would talk about. I think that's an anime ship problem in general. Right. But I know what you mean. Like, that sense of, like, sometimes it feels like they just cram two characters together because I guess we should have a romance.
Right. But at the same time, they're very non-demonstrative. Like, I think that Shin and Bone have more intimacy despite never really resolving that on screen than Yotaro and Konatsu do, despite what clearly they're intimate. They had a child.
Yeah, up until she tells him she's pregnant and it's his kid, I genuinely wasn't sure if their relationship was like more just kind of a familial thing where they got married because it made sense, or if they were an intimate married couple. So I was like, oh, okay, you guys do bang. Good for you.
Congrats on the sex.
But it is like they very clearly they focused on that relationship. They focused a lot more on their kind of emotional bond and like you were saying, you know, you can get a feel for how they would just hang out on a regular day and go about
just
their
like
business.
The fact that they love each other's performance, like as a like fact that they're specifically a performing couple, like they're both artists and they love each other's work so much, is it gets me right in the feels.
Yeah, well, and the thing about, like, to me, Yotaro isn't I like Yotaro. He's not a super interesting character on his own, but how he interacts and changes the people around him is really interesting. And the support he gives Konatsu goes a long way towards her kind of having the courage to sort of get out of that mentality of, oh, I can't be a part of the Rakugo world, and, you know, kind of try to struggle towards that dream. And I think that, and obviously, you know, she supports him too, and so it's that mutual bond there is really, really nice.
I will say that Yotaro was kind of what caught my eye at first because he's because he's so. I expected him to be kind of the, you know, the character, the reluctant punk who sort of eventually melts and admits that he likes the thing, but Yotaro is just so sincerely enthusiastic from the word go in a way that's unusual and very endearing. It's so sweet.
He's a sweet boy.
He is a sweet boy. Well, and he does sort of tie in a very different way. He kind of ties into that same sort of underlying thread about people being told they can't do something because of something in their past or how they were born or things like that, because his background as a criminal does kind of cause him some problems, and the fact that the fact that Bon is willing to, you know, take him on and stand up for him and not be bothered about the rumors that are going around is, I think it's one of the early signs where you're like, oh, he is still a big teddy bear at heart. kind of trying to look out for the strays around him in the same way that, he maybe didn't necessarily feel like he was growing up.
Well, I think there's an interesting reversal at play too, because Konatsu and Yotaro, Bon, both are those, like I said, those kind of characters who are very similar but seem opposite at first. Whereas once you start going on the flashback, you start with Yotaro, and then you switch over and you have Shin instead, and those two initially seem like very similar characters of these very like open, sincere kinds of young men who open up the people around them, and they turn out to be very different kinds of people. And at a certain point, I realized that this show is the very specific subgenre that I like, which is period pieces that are unexpectedly gay. This is very good.
Prove that, yeah. That was definitely a topic that was going to come up eventually, but let's just get into it now.
Yeah.
The relationships is in the backstory, especially, are complex and a lot of subtext and kind of open to interpretation. So I was kind of curious to hear sort of how, I think Vry's answer to this would be somewhat obvious, but how you kind of read that based on kind of what we saw, and just kind of your feelings about the way they handled that sort of, I guess I would call it a love triangle, but it's kind of a half-hearted love triangle.
It's sort of interesting looking at the background of the people, like what the people who have actually worked on the series have said. Like Ishida and Hayashibara have referred to them as being in love, romantic love. The manga artist sort of has stated that she started off seeing Miyokichi more as a villain and an obstacle, and not as an actual prospect. So that's sort of I don't really have any conclusive interpretations. Like, that's one of those things where I have like a very soft sort of, it is, you can interpret it either way, no reading is incorrect. But I totally do believe that Bon is in love with Shin, and he is sort of not realizing it, and Miyokichi is, I think she's so messed up that I don't think she's really capable of like loving anyone for who they are, just what she like, because she she's got such a tragic past, and she's been betrayed and used by men over and over and over. So I think she saw Bon as someone who would not use her the same way that she had been. She complains about him not being interested in sex, but I think him not pursuing sex with her is one of the things that she also in some way liked about him. She knew that he wasn't just going to what's the horrible vulgar phrase that I'm looking for? Hit it and quit it.
Well, and I think she even says that, like, when they first meet, she's like, you don't look at me the way most people look at me. I forget exactly what the line is, but it is that very much that sense of, like, you don't just look at me like I'm a piece of meat. And no, I do. She's fascinating to me because she's one of those characters while watching the show I have a really hard time sympathizing with. And I think she's sort of, well, more. I sympathize with her more as the series went on, and I think Kumota, the manga author, even said that she kind of changed up the ending for her, based partly on Hayashibara's performance, because she just gave her so many more kind of layers and complexities than what was maybe in the initial, like on the page. That it kind of almost changed the manga artist's thoughts on the character, which I think is a really cool kind of interchange of ideas between two mediums. But she's one of those characters to me where you kind of have to dive yourself back into the 50s and 60s, I guess pretty much the 50s, in Japan, because she's trying to live a life that is, like, geisha and like courtesans and things like that are being phased out because of the anti-prostitution laws, and she's getting older, and so she's living in this world where the job she knows is no longer available, but as a woman there's very little else open to her if she can't get married. So
And Bon,
I
maybe
think that
meaning well, tells her, well, just you can do whatever you want. But like, what does that mean when she has? She's
Yeah, and it's like, no, she can't.
he's trying, but it's and when he says that, there's that part of me like, as a woman in 20, I guess it was 16 at the time. I was like, yeah, you tell her, Bon. And then I'm like, no, Dee, shut up. That is your privilege and his privilege talking. She can't just do whatever she wants. That's not the world y'all live in. And so her frustrations with him after he says that, I think, are a lot more understandable when you kind of put it into the historical context. And then the way she kind of immediately gloms onto Shin, because she really, I mean, that's kind of her way of surviving at that point.
it is interesting to me that I need a chart, and also I need Shin and Yurie to like sit down and work out a schedule for their boyfriend, because clearly things could have been. Listen, poly relationships are about responsible communication, and you're all failing terribly. Stop it.
Yeah, they all did a real bad job of talking to each other. And then they're all kind of held back by various social constraints in terms of like, oh well, you're supposed to marry this kind of person, and you're supposed to have this kind of life, and the characters who kind of like Shin kind of tries to rebel against that a little bit and gets kicked out on his ass basically. Right. So there are very real. So it's very much to me like. Obviously they do need to talk more, but to me the tragedy in that first season is very much more a tragedy of the environment and of their circumstances than of some fatal flaw of any one or multiple characters.
Yeah, and that's sort of the tragedy of all the characters.
Yeah, absolutely. And the second season just happens to not be a tragedy, largely because there were forces in place that are like working to make things better.
Well, and I remembered my thought. With Yurie,
yes.
It's interesting that she's very much a character that to not just write her off as the woman who's in the way of the BL relationship, which I think is the mangaka's roots showing themselves a little bit. Like you really have to dig your feet into the context, which should also theoretically be true of Bon, because because of his time he's pushed away from being in a relationship with her, and certainly it goes without even saying probably with Shin, but those elements of societal pressure are baked overtly into his narrative. Like the anime goes out of its way to show us that in a way it doesn't with Yurie, which I think is an interesting dichotomy. I can't talk anymore. Words are gone.
I know what you meant. Well, I think part of that is because we are getting that entire backstory from Bon's perspective, and he's very limited in exactly how much he knows about the other characters, so we don't get quite as much of their sort of unique circumstances. We get it kind of in fits and starts.
Like Shin's terrible
holy
shit alcoholism. Oh my god.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Shin has alcoholism like the whole story, and no, it's not really addressed because it probably wouldn't have been back then.
Well, in Japan,
tries,
Japan's attitude towards alcoholism in general is very not a.
Is it
not a thing?
Well, yeah. It took me a while to catch on that they were seriously addressing it as a problem in the anime, because the lovable, lush playboy character is so frequently used, but.
And once he's like trying to function on his own, like he and his daughter are living in squalor. He's too busy drinking away any money that she gets to like go out and find a job for himself. Like what alcohol did to him was very like really messed up.
Well, and I think at that point it's a combination of both, because I think he was sort of like, I mean, I hate to use the term functioning alcoholic, but it is a thing. And I think that he was still kind of there beforehand, because he was still like, well, I want to do these performances. I want to go out and take care of these things. So he kind of had that to balance it a little bit. But then when they go out to that town, like by the time Bon finds him out in the village, it's not just alcoholism. Like he's pretty deeply in depression as well. And those two things just combine into a cocktail of awful.
It was like
and he's in a bad place by then.
As somebody who kind of follows the culture around stand-up comedy, I don't think this was done purposefully, but it is very interesting to me how Shin kind of spiral into falling apart once he lost his career opportunities, parallels that kind of cultural element of, well, you're always performing in clubs and you're going out and meeting and greeting people where there's a lot of alcohol and you're supposed to be the fun guy, and then you have this problem and no one cares.
Yeah, no, that's actually a good point. That is a part of the Rakugo culture. I remember kind of reading up on this. What were they called? Futatsume, right? That's like you're not an apprentice anymore, but you're
the journeyman. Yeah.
Part of what was kind of expected of a futatsume was because so many of your stories, like basically like researching your stories kind of thing. So they would encourage them to like hang out at the brothels and go out getting smashed on their nights off, because it was like technically it was considered sort of part of their job, so they'd have a better idea of how to play the characters that they were playing in these in their more kind of risque raucous type stories. So yeah, that's a great parallel there, right? Because it very much was a part of the history too.
But like do that, but keep yourself under control, and that's your problem. We have no safety net for you.
Yep.
But Bon found him and kind of helped him get his life back together. And for one wonderful episode, they were so happy.
My God, it was so beautiful.
For one brief shining moment.
Yeah.
And they were so happy.
I guess the only other thing, well, there are 8 million things we could talk about on the whole complicated relationship front, but also I remain fascinated by that idea of like, is Bone very closeted, or is he ace, or is he both?
Yeah, the thing with Bone that I found that I really liked about his character and sort of related to on a very personal level was how he develops these very deep emotional relationships with people, but you never really get the sense that that there's a physical aspect to it. Like,
right.
He and Shin will give each other hugs and he's perfectly happy. But then you'll see, like, Yurie will kind of try to, there's a few scenes where they're, like, just hanging out together and it's very kind of relaxing and comforting, and he's fine with that. Like, he leans his head on her shoulder, and it's, again, like, he seems comfortable with that. But then when she tries to do things that are a little more kind of, like, sexually oriented, he gets very uncomfortable and kind of pulls away. And then that line she drops where she basically says he almost never let me have sex with him. To me, he reads as very ace, but still develops romantic relationships with people. And so when he finds Shin and Konatsu and kind of gets to adopt himself or adopt her and kind of marry Shin, I guess, he seems I think that's about the happiest you see him in the entire show.
Yeah.
And I don't get the sense that he's like, and you don't get the sense that there's like that part of him that's like, oh, if only we could also make out. Like, you don't, there's not that sense at all. Like, it seems like he would be perfectly happy just having this kind of platonic married couple relationship. And I think I love it in that episode, and when they get to have their little dual Rakugo performance, and it's so good. It's my favorite part.
He is very sex repulsed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, whenever,
or at the very least uncomfortable.
Shin brings home women, he's just like, oh God, just go, get out of here, gross, icky girls.
It's and that, I guess that's because I feel like there are exactly two weird sour notes in the series, and one is Bone licking Yurie's tears, which we can kind of explain away afterwards, and the other one is, what the other one is.
Yeah. We'll talk about that.
Do we have to?
I mean, I feel like we can't. You can't.
Yeah, no, we can't not
without discussing the final episode's kind of weird question mark that it leaves open at the end that none of us were asking. None of us were asking Higuchi. So yeah, and it is that the rumor or the theory, I guess, that Konatsu and Bon maybe had a sexual relationship at one point or another. Yeah, super gross. And it does. It's a very jarring moment at the end of the series.
And like the fact that it's asked with such this, like, I always had a hard time with Higuchi because he reminds me of another character in another series that I hate. So.
Oh yeah.
Who is it?
His name is David Talbot, and he's a prick. I hate him, and no one has ever heard of him, and that's fine. Keep on with that. But just so the fact that he's got this very completely, and I know D that your argument has always been that he's always been clueless, which I think
He's always wrong. Like, he keeps coming up with these theories. He's like, oh, I bet Bon killed Shin and Yurie in a moment of passion. And then he finds out the actual story, and it's nothing like that. And then he'll go on these, like, long philosophical musings about the purpose of Rakugo. And every time he does, like, we cut over to Yotaro, and he's like, what? What do you even know? Shut up. Like, not even really paying attention. And Higuchi's all like, notice me, senpai!
Higuchi's, like, the absolute epitome of a clueless academic.
Yeah, and I get the feeling he's kind of supposed to be a joke character. So because of his long history of being wrong, I don't put a lot of credence into the idea that that Konatsu, that Bon actually is little Shinosuke's dad. Largely because of that. But then there's still that question of, like, why even bring it up in the story in the first place? And I have some thoughts on that, but, like, I mean, I want to give you guys a chance to talk, too, so... do you have anything else you want to add about that?
I mean, obviously, but I do think it's interesting that they choose that moment. I guess it's in keeping with the show's very reticent approach to feelings, especially intimate feelings, but that they choose that moment to have Konatsu confirm that she was in love with him for a while. And I wish, having read that the little short side story that came with, what was it, volume 10, I wish
it was like an epilogue short story.
I wish that had been in the anime, because to me that is the far better encapsulation of those feelings, where she's just young and angry and looking for attention, and she's a weird hormonal teenager, so naturally she's sublimating that into a crush. And meanwhile, Bon is like, oh no, I know what this sad feeling is. Oh no.
Yeah, and then sort of deliberately pushes her away after that, which also kind of explains some of the coldness in their relationship. I mean, part of it is, again, just he as a person is very nervous about forming bonds with people because he's been abandoned so many times.
And I mean, their relationship was pretty badly poisoned when she came to the conclusion that he had murdered her. That he had murdered her parents.
Yeah, and he was okay with her needing to blame him. So he was like, yeah, that's fine. Blame me if you need to do that. I kind of blame myself.
Right. I really hope that you'll get around to killing me one of these days.
Yeah, please, gosh, God, please.
That's such a sad arc especially when you really kind of deal with the fact that Bon is a character who probably his entire life, but definitely since the accident, has been dealing with pretty serious depression off and on.
Yeah.
Which was something that I don't think I hadn't thought of it in those terms until he's in the theater and it gets set on fire. He sets it on fire. There's a question mark there.
That's the one. The show's one real dip into kind of sort of magical realism, almost.
Yeah, it plays with that a lot with the Rakugo performances, like Miyokichi's ghost or Yurie's ghost showing up, and then the Shinigami and Shin visiting Bon during these, like, lower points when he's, like, hovering on the edge of life and death. And so he does have a couple of these, like, suicide attempts at the end, which are really hard to watch. But it just gives you a better idea of, like, I mean, he like Caitlin said, he is kind of a jerk, and he is kind of an asshole to people, and he gets better as the series goes, but there is very much that sense of, like, a lot of it comes from, I'm intentionally pushing you away because on the one hand, like, I think I'm a bad person, and on the other hand, I don't want to get hurt anymore, which again makes him, he's one of my favorite fictional characters I think ever, because he's just so there's so much there. Like, he's so well written and complicated and sympathetic, and sometimes pisses you off, and I really like that about it.
Well, I mean, I was trying really hard to rack my brain, and I could not think of another character that we follow from childhood to natural old age death.
I mean, are any of the Joestars?
Like, I feel like, listen, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is not a real show. It's just an elaborate prank. I believe this with my full heart.
Yeah, I don't know enough about JoJo's, but if they follow the characters from birth to death, that's pretty cool. It's definitely very rare to see.
It is
for sure.
Especially so closely.
I don't want to
get
in on JoJo's here.
Oh yeah, that's fair. What were you saying, Vrai?
Well, just like especially, I guess not even like especially so closely because a lot of it's not completely unheard of to see a character to flashback to a character when they're young and then see them as old mentors. But we stick with Bon through pretty much every major development in his life.
Right. Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. And we, the fact that they have managed to build such a complex character in 13 episodes, because he was already incredibly complicated by the end of the first season.
No, that's true.
The fact that they built up this very, very complicated character very, very quickly is just absolutely incredible. And all of the characters are very complicated.
They are. Yeah, absolutely.
Like, Miyokichi is, even though she, like I said, she was originally sort of conceived as a villain, she did develop a lot of, I could see a lot of complexity when I looked at her, even if it wasn't totally intentional.
Yeah, no, I think she becomes a tragic figure in her own right too.
And she absolutely does. And I think sort of one of the things about Yotaro is that by contrast, he's not super complex, but in a very real way. Like, he is still written as a person with the full range of human emotions, but he's just a very sweet, simple guy with simple hopes and simple dreams and simple desires.
Yeah, he's definitely more straightforward than the others, but like you said, he doesn't feel two-dimensional at all. He feels like a person who just is more straightforward, who goes, well, this is what I want to do, and so here's what I'm going to do.
Right, like he has his struggle with finding his own Rakugo and how he wants to express that, but as far as emotional self-actualization, he's pretty much there.
To me, he's the kind of, and I think one of the reasons Yotaro's story is a lot more straightforward than the others is because pretty much every character is kind of looking for a place where they can be accepted and belong. And most of them are denied that until quite a bit later in their lives. Yotaro is accepted into the Rakugo world, and when it looks like maybe that's going to fall apart, at the very beginning of season 2, when his history as a criminal is coming out and people aren't signing him up for shows anymore, he goes to Bon and is really upset about this, and Bon is like, no, you're fine, embrace your past, you're my student, this is keep working. And so he gets that kind of wholehearted acceptance from both Bon and Konatsu,
right?
Which is really lovely,
because he offers Bon and Konatsu it to them as well.
Yeah, and then he in turn gives that to them, and
he sort of because Bon and Konatsu, part of their whole deal is that they've never really had that sort of acceptance in their lives. Someone who was unconditionally supportive.
And they kind of did with each other. They just refused to admit it. So it still made their relationship fraught with horrible trouble for a long, long time.
Yeah, but instead of just Konatsu has him, and even though she is not the kind of person who can just come out and be happy about it, he's just yeah, you can do Rakugo. You're great at Rakugo.
And then they hug, and it's so good.
It's so good. He gets her, and he's like, "You do the show. Go on. You'll be great."
I mean, yeah, and even in the beginning, when she was still very young and very angry, he was just very wholeheartedly supportive.
As soon as he finds out she's pregnant, he's like, "Well, what if I marry you and help you raise the kid?" And didn't even hesitate.
He's a good boy.
He's a good boy.
He's just a sweet boy who is just full of love and acceptance, and part of that is to his detriment. The whole reason he got arrested was because he just sort of attached himself to this strong leader, and that strong leader unfortunately was a criminal. So
yeah, that is it's not really touched on too much in the show, but I think that's an interesting element for a character who is as open as Yotaro is this, how do you find people who are worth the amount of trust you're willing to place in them?
Right.
I am a little bit sad that Crunchyroll viewers didn't get the full double premiere of season 2, only partly because I wanted to spend more time with that delightful reporter who looks kind of like James.
My friend really liked that guy. The fancy boy.
I loved the fancy lad, and I wanted to spend more time with him.
Yeah, I think he's in. Right, you're talking about the season 1 like prologue, the OVA that got truncated down into a short episode, right? That's what we're talking about?
I think it was for I think season must have been the season 1 OVA then. The stuff that's a lot of the stuff about the tattoo and like Yotaro's years coming forward to the present, that like decade or so.
Yeah. I will forever have my fingers crossed that we'll get some really nice Blu-ray release and it'll have that full like OVA on it, so we get those little bits of extra detail, because I do think those would have been helpful going into season 2, especially with some of the characters who kind of just show up and you're like, who's that guy?
Right. Very, very fancy. I'm so easy to please.
He grows a shitty mustache.
Someone hold him down and take away that terrible mustache. It's a bad time that I had to see with my own 2 eyes.
It's a bad mustache.
Do we have a beat on... Has season 1 been... I want a physical release of this show is what I'm saying. Give it to me. Put it in my face.
It has not. I don't think it has gotten...
Oh.
Yeah, I don't think there's any announcement. I was talking to Peter, who's, dear listeners, is also on the anime Feminist staff, if you didn't know, who does some work for Crunchyroll as well, and so he sent out a message about how he wanted a good Blu-ray release, and I was like, well, Peter, you should tell your company to get on that then. Because I would love a complete edition with all the bonus information we have not gotten yet.
Dub for this show would be so weird, wouldn't it? Just because of the heavy amount of cultural stuff?
Yeah,
I don't
I'm not
know
sure
if
you'd
it's
even
dubbable.
Yeah, I'm not sure you would even bother. I think it might be one of those releases that you just, and again, because it is pretty niche, as much as we love to plug it, it is a fairly...
The people who watched it love it, but that's not a whole lot of people. It's definitely like a cult following.
Samurai flamenco syndrome, I call it.
Well, a very different kind of show.
Had the thing where a bunch of people just rage quit.
Very consistently good from.
I think it's a difficult one to get into just because of that kind of historical, both cultural and historical hurdle. So you're, as somebody in the U.S., you're like, okay, what's Rakugo? What was Japan like in the 50s? Which I'm sure there are people in Japan who were also like, what was Japan like in the 50s? But then you also have that historical level, so it's not just this takes place in Japan, it's this takes place in Japan in around World War II. And so kind of easing yourself into that world and that mindset. And I think the characters are extremely well written enough that, I think you can connect to them regardless of where you are. But kind of getting over that first hurdle of the subject matter itself, I think, can be a little bit tricky.
But at the same time, I think that also makes it kind of incredibly special, because if you don't speak Japanese, and even if you do, you're probably never going to be able to see a live Rakugo performance or even listen to one of the recordings like they have in the show. Like, it's just an insurmountable character barrier without this kind of drama wrapped around it to explain it to you.
Rakugo is reasonably accessible, and there actually are a handful of Rakugo performers who perform in English.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It has... Don't let the show fool you. Rakugo has actually evolved with the times quite a bit.
Yeah. The series is kind of an alt history. I guess Komoda came out in an interview about this. Carice, who has done a bunch of interviews for the series, was telling me about this. And Komoda intentionally set the show to take place in kind of an alt history where Rakugo was, like, legit dying. Mm-hmm. It went through kind of a slump in the real world, but it was never as bad off as the show makes it out to be. There were female performers, like professionals, by the early 90s in the real world. And then there were foreigners doing it, I want to say in the early aughts is when you started to see that kind of pop up.
That's really interesting. I learned a thing.
Yeah, it's the show makes it out where after the theater burns down, no one performs Rakugo in Tokyo for 15 years. The show had been in such like a sort of real world setting that the sudden alternate history felt kind of jarring to me, because I hadn't really noticed that it was had been diverging from the real world. Because they're making such a big stink about Konatsu finally being the first female Rakugoka, when there had been women performing Rakugo for 20 years, which also, like, they make such a big deal out of it, and she's got such an important arc in this season, and we don't even get to see her performance.
I thought that was kind of a bummer too. I'd like to think there's an extended version where we get to see her.
Oh, I hope so.
I want to see Konatsu perform. Anyway, but yeah, it was really strange because Rakugo absolutely did evolve with the times. Like, I'm sure there were a lot of people who fought tooth and nail against it because, culturally, a lot of Japan is very, very reluctant to accept change. A lot of things are done in very old-fashioned ways that are unimaginable here. When I worked there, you know how we communicated between places? It's faxes.
The last fax machines on Earth.
Yeah,
we were not there in the 90s.
Because Japan was not adopting any new ways of communication. While I'm sure there were people who fought changes to Rakugo really hard and who did have Bon's perspective of, well, if it has to change in order to survive, I would rather it just died. It did evolve, and I think it's awesome that it did. And so I had been sort of mentally preparing myself for that point in the show. I had been doing some mild research on female Rakugo performers. When that didn't happen, it was just like, wait, what?
That's sincerely fascinating to me, because I am a goofball dum-dum who just kind of said, well, the anime said it, so I guess that's how it happened. It is very good for my dumb bad brain to have these actual facts.
Yeah, researching Rakugo while also doing the write-ups for it was really fascinating. Because and it is because the idea in the series is that Bon is digging in his heels in a lot of kind of strange ways, because he's not, again, he decides to bring Yotaro into his family, but he doesn't really stop him from talking to Higuchi and doing new things. He just doesn't help him. So you do kind of get the sense that he moves very gradually over the course of that second season. Well, really from the moment he meets Yotaro on, from that sense of screw it, Rakugo's gonna die. I'm gonna take it down with me, like a jealous lover, to kind of realizing I can't stop this from happening, and kind of backing off, to then finally kind of accepting that change and being able to die peacefully, knowing that, kind of letting Rakugo go, letting it know that it will carry on without him, and kind of entrusting it to the two people who were most important.
And I know that, afterlife scenes can be cheesy, but God, I needed it so much in this show.
Yeah, I think it was really important to sort of get that last bit, to get that sort of coda to his arc. Because he did have a lot of unfinished business that he could not finish in the world of the living, because it was with people who were dead. And the show was wrapping everything up with him so beautifully. They couldn't not.
Yeah, you kind of had to get that capstone. And not just, absolutely to wrap up Bon's arc and kind of that final sense of peace that he was able to get, but also to give us just a little bit more with Shin and Yurie.
It's so nice to see Yurie get closure. So nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and really to see... Sorry, go ahead again.
That really only happened because of Megumi Hayashibara.
Oh.
Yeah, she helped give Yurie a better ending, and it was really nice to see that they weren't just suffering eternally. They weren't damning Bon the way he and I think Konatsu had worried they were doing from the afterlife. They were they wanted them to be happy, and they were grateful that they had each other, that Konatsu and Bon had each other, and so then being able to kind of say goodbye like that. and murder us all with a pinky promise.
Oh, I'd like shout out to Matsuda, we haven't talked about at all, but who is the best.
Oh gosh.
Oh, Matsuda.
Yes. We're actually running. We're coming close up to the hour, so Matsuda's a great place to stop because he's kind of like secret hero of the story, I think, in a lot of ways.
This idea of like the roadie of Rakugo, the people who make it happen.
Yeah, the sort of perpetual caretaker, and then I love that we got his story at the very end, and that sort of, because Rakugo is so much about storytelling, and so to kind of wrap it back around to everyone has a story, even this guy who's been with us from the beginning, who you barely knew who he was in the first episode, and then like gradually became more and more of a character. Even he has a story, and even he has, a important place in this narrative. Good. It was a good final moment, I guess.
What we're saying is that this show is very good, and you should watch it because, like,
it is extremely good.
If at least 5 more people watch it, maybe we'll get that DVD.
And then make 5 more people watch it, and we'll start it's a pyramid scheme.
Those always
of
work.
Rakugo Blu-ray. That's where this is going for sure. So watch Rakugo if you haven't already. Which, if you're listening to this and you haven't already watched Rakugo,
what are you doing?
Well,
you must be very confused. But I'm glad you stayed with us regardless. All right. Folks, that's going to do it for us today. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Chatty AF. If you like what you heard, tell your friends. And if you really liked what you heard, consider tossing $1 or more to our Patreon each month. Your support really does go a long way towards making Anime Feminist happen, both in print and in your earbuds. If you're interested in more from the AniFem team and all of our wonderful contributors, please check us out at www.animefeminist.com. We're also on Facebook at AnimeFem, on Twitter at AnimeFeminist, and we recently launched our Tumblr at AnimeFeminist as well. We don't have a pithy closing line for the podcast just yet, so I'm going to fall awkwardly into silence and hope our editor fills this space with some catchy theme music. I believe in you, Peter.